one of my very good friend and colleague at the University of East London. Milda is a senior lecturer in business psychology, and she has worked in 3 different countries, including Lithuania and the United States. And she has been doing research on workplace bullying for more than 10 years. And she's also part of the main research group on this topic, the Bergen Bullying Research Group. Thank you, Milda, for this talk today.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeremy. This is such a lovely introduction. I didn't know what you're going to say. I love it. Thank you, everyone who joined me today. I really appreciate, out of all the things you could have done for the next hour, you decided to focus on workplace bullying, one of the most stressful and one of the most dysfunctional phenomena in the workplace. But this is also an important topic for us to look into and approach. For us as bystanders, for us as potentially targets, and for us as organizational representatives, CEOs, leaders, or just employees. So let me just share my slides that I have prepared for you today. And yeah, today's presentation is focusing on something that I have been passionate for probably around 13 years, and I was always kind of leaning more towards dark side of businesses and business psychology. So workplace bullying and aggression at work was a fascinating topic for me. And the question, why do we as adults, grown-up individuals who were taught by our parents, our families, our school teachers, why do we still act aggressive and violent at work to our colleagues, to our leaders, to our followers? Now, the first question that I would like to pose today is it really a problem? Is workplace bullying a problem, a challenge in today's organizations? And let me just start by sharing some cases. Most of us are probably in the UK, although I saw some colleagues from Lithuania joining us today too, so hello to those. But let me just focus on a couple of cases that happened quite recently here in the UK. Now, this is a headline from the Guardian saying inquiry calls for urgent action to stop bullying and harassment by MPs. Now, Houses of Parliament was identified one of the organizations that suffers, that is extensively affected by workplace bullying, work harassment, and sexual harassment. Now, in the report, they announced that especially women are affected by these negative actions and behaviors at the workplace. And recommendation was made to not only focus on employee training or awareness raising, but actually to tackle the roots. So changing the whole culture of an organization. Now, these changes are not easy to make, especially when we have organizations with long-lasting traditions. Now, this article was published about a year ago, and this is where we still are now or today. Priti Patel, who is Secretary of the State and an active leader in Vote Leave, in the context of Brexit, she was accused of bullying for a number of times now, and I think first articles came up in media in March, but probably like a week ago we heard again about workplace bullying cases linked to Priti Patel's behavior. Finally, although certain actions have been taken and certain initiatives are now being implemented in the Houses of Parliament and House of Commons and House of Lords, however, we still see many challenges because of this, I want to say, pretty old-fashioned and system that has long tradition. So a leader of House of Commons actually proposed to question independent complaint panel's decision. So independent complaint panel was introduced as one of potential intervention tools to deal with bullying and harassment cases in Parliament. So the aim of this panel is to look into the cases and provide with recommendations that would then be followed. Rees-Mogg suggested that in the critical cases where decisions are made around MPs' actions being suspended, Parliament should have voice to question such decisions. So we can still see how resistant organizations can be in terms of intervening with workplace bullying. But couple of questions that I want to proceed with today, and I call this triune system, referring to our brain structure really, is what is it? What is workplace bullying actually? What is work harassment? Because if we can't really, define it, if we can't really describe what it is, it's challenging to notice it or see it. So we're going to focus on the first question first. What is it? We're going to move to who is responsible. And that is such a crucial question when we talk about workplace bullying, because if we're able to answer this question, then we are able to intervene at the right place at the right time. And finally, the question, what to do, what can you do as a person who possibly potentially experiences these negative behaviors? What can you do, a person who observes these behaviors in the workplace? And what can you do as a leader, as representative of the organization? These are the three core questions that I want to discuss with you today. And I'm really happy to hear your questions and answer your questions after this presentation. Now, I like numbers. I'm a quantitative researcher. I like to call myself quantitative researcher. So I'm gonna, kind of remind you of certain numbers today. So we started with three questions, and I now want to focus on number 6. Okay, so 6 is a number of core identifying features for workplace bullying. Now you can see 7 actually, but let's get to number 7 and let's talk about it in more detail so you can see whether it's actually very relevant or is it something that we may wish to consider but is not a core feature. Now, the very first and kind of basic feature is that workplace bullying is always negative and hostile behavior. We can see that in some organizations, management may say that, you know what, this is not bullying, this is not negative behavior, this is just a leadership style, this is how we deal with challenges at work. Well, this is not true. In the next slide, I'm gonna go and look into a couple of examples of this negative and hostile behavior, and you're gonna see that these behaviors are actually attributed to workplace bullying, and in the research these behaviors are proved to be linked to dysfunctional outcomes for the target, for bystanders, and organization as a whole. Now, the second feature is what makes workplace bullying really complex phenomenon and really challenging to observe and prove. So workplace bullying is psychological in nature, which means that different school bullying actually choose subdued behaviors that are not easily observable. Now, the third feature, which is very important, is that it must be repeated. We all can be aggressive at times. We all can challenge others. We can shout, we can scream, we can throw things. But if it's repeated and if it's lasting for a longer period of time, then it is workplace bullying and not just some negative incivil behavior or conflict. We always have two parties. So we have victims or targets. By the way, I use these terms interchangeably. And we have so-called instigators or perpetrators. We also see there is a third party in this phenomenon, and the third party, in fact, is really powerful. And I want you to take this home with you, because the third party is bystander, and this is what you probably are. Bystanders is important party because they have the power to stop this phenomenon. We have power imbalance, which is again very important feature, and it signifies that in workplace bullying, target or victim ultimately feels for some reason unable to defend themselves. It may be because the perpetrator or instigator is a leader, is in senior position. It may be because there are more people than just one. It may be because the instigator is very charming and charismatic and very powerful in some psychological ways, and it's so difficult to fight against that person. And the sixth feature is that it leads to negative consequences, and this affects all the parties. It's not only the identified patient, which is target, but it's also bystanders and organization as a whole. In so many ways, organizations, bystanders, and victims, they all experience negative outcomes. Now, finally, if we are very much excited and interested in research, and I'm sure that you are very interested in research, and you look into definitions of workplace bullying and workplace harassment, you can see that intention is normally attributed, and researchers say that, you know what, it has to be intentional. People must want to, to harass someone, must be doing that, you know, consciously. But in reality, and this is an important message as well, in reality, people are not necessarily aware. And this again can be due to so many different reasons. One reason, it may be because they are just used to this behavior, because this is the way they acted forever. And this was accepted in another circumstance. Maybe they are coming from a culture that, you know, accepts this form of behavior, or perhaps organization treats employees in similar ways, and this is what we learn. We learn that this is acceptable. This is, you know, we can do exactly the same thing with others. So as I mentioned to you, or as I told you, I'm gonna very briefly let you look into some of behavioral forms of workplace bullying. And in an instrument published in 2009, which is still used and it's probably most used in research on workplace bullying, called Negative Acts Questionnaire, published by Einarsson and colleagues, these researchers cluster workplace bullying mainly, or workplace bullying behaviors mainly, around two general groups: person-focused behaviors and work-focused behaviors. So person-focused behaviors kind of approaches or are directed towards an individual, towards their personality. So some examples are spreading of gossips and rumors, insulting remarks made about a person, their habit, their background, their culture, their race, being ignored, experiencing excessive sarcasm or teasing. Now, we also observe work-related behaviors, such as withholding important information that leaves you to fail, that affects your performance, or being ordered to do work below your level of competence, or hints or signals that you should quit your job. And this is a form that may be much more prevalent now in COVID-19, where so many organizations are being restructured. And then finally, repeated reminders of errors and mistakes that you have made at work. So generally, we see that person-focused behaviors cause more harm to the target because they are more obvious, they are more directed towards an individual, herself or himself. The question that was asked by one of my brilliant students not long time ago was, okay, but now we're working from home, which means that we have, you know, less frequent interactions with actual people at work, and it's everything is happening online. So perhaps workplace bullying is not a problem, or maybe it's less of a problem nowadays. Well, it's probably and it may be that it's going to be the other way around. If not yet, it may be in the future. So workplace bullying is already such a challenging and complex phenomenon just because it's so difficult to observe and prove because it's psychological in nature. When we go online, it's even more difficult to prove it, to tackle it. So you can see some of the examples of the changing nature of workplace bullying in COVID-19. So for example, neglecting to copy a person in emails, ignoring makes to posting insulting comments on social media, which is more observed, of course, extensive monitoring of an employee when working from home, and also discussing individual's personal circumstance when he or she is not in the meeting. So these are just some of the examples. The challenging thing in COVID-19 is that with so many organizations undergoing restructuring, stress levels are extremely high, insecurity is extremely high, and people are just, you know, facing this unpredictable environment, which means that even if they are experiencing workplace bullying, they are less likely to talk about it, to voice these concerns, just because of the fear of losing their jobs, of being disbelieved, losing promotion opportunities, etc. Now, I like this slide, and when I was talking to my partner, he said, "You're mad. How are these factors of workplace bullying? This is cake. This is not a cooking class." Well, I like to use a metaphor of a cake when I talk about factors contributing towards workplace bullying. So for my own dissertation, when I was still studying for my PhD, I was looking into two clusters of factors or causes. One was situational factors or organizational factors. So what's in the workplace environment? What is it that causes workplace bullying? Is it about leadership? Is it about certain, you know, job characteristics, certain features of work that trigger that phenomena? Or is it about personality? Maybe some people are just more prone, more vulnerable to experience bullying at work. Or maybe there are, you know, perpetrators who display certain personality characteristics, and because of who they are bullies, you know? Now, the general conclusion is this: if we imagine workplace bullying being a cake, and we try to slice this cake in different parts, saying that this part is this factor and this part is that factor, we can actually see that the greatest contribution towards explaining of workplace bullying goes to organizational causes, organizational or situational factors. And only a very small proportion is actually explained by personality or individual differences. So at the very end, it's mainly about how we deal with things within organizations. Let me just go through some of the causes so you have a better understanding of what contributes towards workplace bullying. So the second question that I posed was, who is responsible? What are the factors? The first one is personality, and although it does not contribute as significantly as organizational causes, we can still see certain trends, right? So in terms of perpetrator characteristics, researchers say that more aggressive people, individuals who display lower self-confidence, individuals who display so-called dark triad, which is narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, they tend to engage in bullying more often, especially psychopathy. It seems to be contributing to workplace bullying due to lack of empathy towards the other person. Greater neuroticism, and very interestingly, being a target. What we see in research is that in many cases, the role of target and perpetrator exchanges over time. So a person who may be a target at time 1 can become a perpetrator in time 2. Guess retribution or revenge, right? Punishment for evil things that you have done. I may exchange roles with you and pursue bullying behaviors towards you. That may be one of the explanations. In terms of targets, once again, we have lower self-confidence, which is a matching feature with perpetrator. We have so-called provocative behavior, and this is when target obstructs attainment of goals, right? So when a target in some case, in some situation, gets in the way for the perpetrator or instigator of achieving their goals, they may be experiencing workplace bullying as a way of getting rid of that person because they are getting in the way of the goal. People who display lower agreeableness, and this is one of 5 component personality model components. And these people can be identified as more confrontational, more argumentative, and sometimes perceived as disrespectful. Again, greater on neuroticism, which is a matching feature with perpetrators, less extroverted, but again, a very important notion here, a very important kind of highlight here is that researchers say, you know what? There is no general victim personality profile. So in other words, we can see certain trends, but there's no rule that if you display this particular feature, you're going to experience bullying at work, right? Now, for example, with less extroverted individuals, what we can see in some research is that if we take these more extroverted people who normally have lower likelihood to experience workplace bullying, but we put them in a stressful working environment, these are the people who become the first targets just because they're easier targets. They're more extroverted, you know, they're more visible, they're more open, they're probably more, you know, they're just nicer, just easier to bully. Continuing with who's responsible, I just want to mention some emotions, and emotions were neglected for so long in business research, and finally we're bringing greater attention towards emotions today. So I just want to mention 4 emotions that are very important when discussing aggression at work, workplace bullying, and the first 3, so-called CAD, contempt, anger, and disgust, also called as other condemning triad, they may trigger aggressive behaviors, or they may trigger workplace bullying. So anger is response to potential harm, especially when we perceive certain actions as intentional. When we feel there's some threat in our organization, we may respond with anger, like in COVID-19, when we feel, okay, my position, my job is at threat, at risk, right? This may trigger anger and aggressive behavior ultimately. Contempt is another interesting emotion because it's related to kind of looking down on someone, and contempt is a basis for discrimination, for exclusion, for racism. Not accepting differences, not accepting different cultures, and that's also part of workplace bullying. And finally, disgust. This is probably the most severe emotion we can experience at the workplace due to negative behaviors, negative dynamics within the workplace. And this is a reaction that we have, emotional reaction that we have towards something that is extremely unethical. So when we observe our leaders or even colleagues abusing someone else or harassing someone else, this may trigger disgust and ultimately aggressive behavior towards possibly these instigators. Now, the final emotion is also important to mention. It contributes differently, but it does contribute because fear is what sustains workplace bullying. Fear is an explanation why targets do not voice their opinions, why they don't talk about their experiences. Fear is the reason why bystanders don't engage, don't object this negative behavior, just because they fear of becoming the next target. Now, the main piece of cake is organizational factors, as I told, right? Going back to the magic number of 3, triune system again, I want to highlight 3 core organizational factors. Each and every one of you who is working in organizational environment, who are involved at some point at some level in leadership actions, you must consider those 3 factors. The first one is stress. People change when under stress. We become more receptive, we become more sensitive, we become more suspicious, we become more aggressive. So organizations creating a certain working environment, they may prevent stress or help to deal with stress better, or they can encourage, induce stress, stress that is dysfunctional for employees and ultimately leading to relationship problems. The second factor is conflict. Now again, organizational culture should be designed in such a way that conflicts are solved in effective, collaborative manner, where open discussions are promoted and restorative, remember this term, restorative and not retributive justice is being implemented in the organization. And finally, leaders, managers, just like parents in the family, they have the responsibility of role modeling and setting the stage for certain behaviors. Now, once again, just to remind you that we are in this situation, in this whole pandemic situation of COVID-19, where the stress levels are highest, the likelihood for conflicts are highest, leadership is challenged. So workplace bullying, it has a greater likelihood to thrive. Now, the very last question, what should we do? What can we do? And really, talking about the role of an organization, I partially want to go back to the causes that I have discussed with you. So first of all, conflict resolution, as I mentioned, focusing on restorative justice, where all parties are involved, where we don't necessarily aim to punish the perpetrator, because remember, sometimes these people, they may not really intend harm, and discussions and good mediation can actually help and solve these relationship problems. In addition, restorative justice allows people to hear each other. And on one hand, perpetrators, they tend to accept, they tend to feel more guilty and accept what they did, whereas targets or victims, they tend to experience more empathy, even though these are perpetrators. The second one is stress management. If we think organizational level, we think about certain job features. So, for example, huge workload is one of the key stressors, or emotional demands, especially in service sector, even in universities, when we have to deal with clients, our students, we have to constantly manage our emotions. And these are all stressors. How does organization help to buffer these, these effects, the stress that we experience? If organization employs an attitude that the customer is always right and we have no flexibility whatsoever, we are more likely to experience stress, and ultimately that may result into dysfunctional outcomes and negative dynamics and workplace bullying. In addition to considering redesigning of the workplaces, training, stress training may be introduced, and this is also helpful at the individual level. Now, remember the 6 features, 6 plus 1. Intentionality. I have been contacted by a number of people who said, you know what? We have this dynamic at the workplace, and it's just so uncomfortable for me to see this on a daily basis. I'm not directly involved, but it just affects me greatly when I see this person, acting really unfairly towards another colleague. What should I do? Sometimes just chat with that perpetrator or a person who's doing negative acts is enough, because it makes them aware that this is not acceptable. This is not something that is funny. This is not something that colleagues appreciate. Function of a leader. Okay, 3 things here again, 3. Function of a leader is being a good detective, a good role model, and fair play, engaging in fair play. What I mean by this is that leader has a challenging role to dissect and understand this really complicated dynamic. In the conflict, it's pretty obvious who's who and where the issue is, and what started this, what triggered. In workplace bullying, it's no longer possible to identify these specific features. It's really difficult to identify who's actually playing a target, who's actually a target, and who's not a target, because target may be positioned as someone who's non-collaborative, someone who's a poor employee, although it's completely not true. But just because another person creates this whole environment inspiring and influencing other colleagues, a leader has a challenging task to understand what the reality actually is. By a role model, I mean that our managers must show what behavior is and is not acceptable. And it's really challenging to do that, especially once again when we're experiencing this situation where organizations are being restructured. So much pressure, so much stress, and it's so difficult to act fair. Still, leaders should aim for that. And finally, leaders have a greater likelihood to engage in workplace bullying as instigators, just because they feel like, you know, as leaders, they have to take action, they have to monitor work, they have to be controlling. But then once again, employing effective leadership styles, engaging in good, effective, fair leadership practices is very important. Now, the last point on this slide is organizational policies. You know, in psychology, we rarely talk about these formal things like policies, but it's extremely important feature. Now, I want you to just briefly look into this case, a case that actually happened, and it happened at Teletech. An employee of Teletech had posted comments about his colleague on Facebook, alleging that she was sexually promiscuous. When this was brought to the attention of the employee was suspended and then dismissed for gross misconduct. Now, the employee, though, did not give up. He brought a claim in the Northern Ireland Industrial Tribunal, alleging that he had been unfairly dismissed and Teletech had breached his rights under 3 articles. Article 8, right to respect for private and family life. Article 9, right to freedom of thought. And 10, right to freedom of expression. Now, comment was actually made outside of work, not during working hours, and it was his personal Facebook page. Now, who's right in this case? I wonder what your opinion is. Well, the decision was made that although this comment was made outside of work on a public forum, the tribunal held that it was reasonable for the employer to reach the finding of gross misconduct because it was a clear breach of Teletech's dignity at work policy. So policy being in place, the right policy supporting these cases and helping to you know, kind of solve the challenges better is just so important, and this case just proves that. Right, what should you do as a bystander? Well, first of all, please be aware of the significant role that you have and the power you have. So Paul and colleagues published in one of the papers in 2012 saying actions, either deliberate or inadvertent, can contribute to outcomes of events which may be classified as bullying. So just because you observe things, just because you're not directly engaging and bullying someone, doesn't mean that you're doing no harm. So be aware of your power. Be aware that you can change things if you talk to the, you know, instigator, because if they don't have audience, they are less likely to engage in these behaviors. Be aware of your fear to become a target. And this is very normal. This is very normal to experience this fear. And in fact, this happens. You know, if you're the only bystander who speaks up for the target, it is likely that you will become a next target, you know. So think about this, think about how to prevent this situation as well. And consider appropriate reaction. I recently had a brilliant student, another brilliant student, who looked into various responses that bystanders may engage in when helping a target. And they can help with both problem-focused as well as emotion-focused behaviors. So problem-focused would be advising a target to, say, go and talk to a line manager, or maybe get some consultation support from certain organization, whereas emotion-focused support is just being there, talking to them, advising on some, you know, stress, maybe managing courses, etc. Always are appropriate and good and helpful, and you know, you have the freedom and power to engage in this. Now, finally, role of a target. The first point, although questionable, just because some researchers say that talking to the perpetrator is very tricky. Because if you talk to the perpetrator, it can make things worse. You know, they may actually become more active in bullying you. But on the other hand, it's inevitable, especially if you're thinking about taking this case to court. The very first thing that they will ask you is, have you talked to the person who, you know, acted negatively towards you? And if you haven't, then there is a great likelihood they don't know what they're doing. And it's, you know, this is the first thing that you have to do anyway. But if they know and you have this in writing, best thing to have this in writing, and they keep continuing this behavior, then it's a problem. Then you can take this forward. And then the next step is talking to your line manager or human resources, people who are there in your organization to assist you with these challenges, with these you know, problems. Collecting the evidence. Well, I told you that it's extremely challenging to prove workplace bullying and its existence. So collecting evidence, emails, messages, maybe even recording conversations, talking to witnesses, bystanders who could actually prove your point is very important. The most challenging kind of behavior that you may engage with is considering publicity. Now, this is the worst thing that can happen to organization. Publicity, negative publicity, when you talk to the media, when you talk, you know, online about negative practices, negative experiences that you had. But on the other hand, it really goes back to how much energy you have yourself, because it's very depleting to do that as well. And finally, taking care of your mental health and well-being, because workplace bullying is extremely detrimental, and in the long term, it does affect not only psychologically, but also physically. A person is affected, experiencing multiple outcomes. So this actually concludes my presentation today. I'm actually quite impressed that I finished on time, and I can't wait to hear your questions and your feedback. Here are a couple of references, and just want to thank you so much for staying with me for these 45 minutes now.
Thank you very much, Milda.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone.
If you guys have any questions, could you post them on the chat, and I will read them out loud, and Milda will be able to answer. There was actually quite a good discussion in the chat during your presentation between Mark and Martin about the link between workplace bullying and different political parties. And Mark has had ask a question that's maybe you could help us to answer. Is bullying more aligned with particular ideologies?
Mark, could you specify what you mean by ideologies?
So this was in the context of talking about different parties. So the Labour Party versus the Conservative Party.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I feel like this probably, and again, excuse me, because I can't speak for, you know, about politics very well. This is not my area, but I would probably compare that with, you know, workplace environment, organizational culture, because obviously those beliefs, those values, the mission drives certain behavior, and it also communicates certain expectations towards people engaged in that particular approach or party or movement or initiative. So absolutely, yes, Mark, I think so. I would think that.
Thank you, Milda. Then Mark asked another question, which was about the relationship between assertiveness and bullying.
Oh, yeah. Well, assertiveness is extremely important for both, for target, you know, and for whoever in the organization, you know, operates in the organizational environment. Unfortunately, targets do lose that assertiveness skill at some point due to loss of resources or support from other parties. Now, Mark, I think the key feature here is that workplace bullying is repetitive, even in the case where someone communicates to you that this behavior is not acceptable. Okay, so you can, you know, Mark, you can be assertive when talking to me, right? And I may not mind this. I may be like, okay, you know, that's fine. That behavior is acceptable. But if I don't feel right, you know, and I see, Mark, you know what you say, you know, the way you approach things is not something that makes me feel comfortable, and you still do that, then, you know, we're talking about something different from just assertiveness. That means that, well, there's some other agenda involved.
Thank you, Milda. The next question is from Pamela, who asks, do you think the bully selects their victim depending on personality?
Yes and no, Pamela. I think that we can't separate that from organizational environment. So it really depends on the context that we operate in. And yes, in some organizations, we can see that particular targets are becoming easier, so-called easier targets, right? So I have been working with this organization, which is very, still kind of engages with very old-fashioned kind of approaches, leadership approaches, where they tease and make fun of each other, etc. So whoever does not engage in this behavior, whoever is not competitive enough and does not tease and make fun of everyone else, becomes you know, potential target. So you know what, it's yes and no. You know, my answer is yes and no, very political answer, I guess, because we can't separate this dynamic between instigator and target from organizational environment and rules and regulations that are placed on us.
Thank you, Milda. The next question is for Mark, who asks the relationship between individualism, collectivism, and bullying.
What is the relationship between individualism, collectivism, and bullying? Wow, we could talk about this forever, I think. I think one of the challenges is probably when we live in you know, London or similar kind of metropolitan cities where we see great diversity and organizations are not ready to engage and promote and teach employees about the existing diversity and how we can better engage with it and celebrate it and even benefit from it, then individualism and collectivism can clash, you know, and these values, these orientations can cause certain conflict. So yeah, absolutely. And then once again, you know, I think one challenge that we individualistic cultures experience is that, especially in service organizations, those organizations that work with clients, customers, even students, is that on one hand, we have the belief that we, you know, the focus, we have to be who we are, you know, express our emotions. But on the other hand, the customer is always right. And this causes conflict within ourselves. And this is just so stressful. We have lower capacity to deal with this as compared to possibly people coming from collectivist cultures who are much more, you know, oriented towards others, communities and groups. So yeah, but Mark, there are so many things that can be tackled or linked to individualism and collectivism.
Thank you, Milda. The next question is from Ginte, who asks how organizational psychologists can help in situations when two managers, one from a lower level and other one from a higher level, is accusing each other of bullying.
Wow. How can organizations help? Well, you know, one thing is to engage the upper or senior management, of course, in with this. Yeah, it's really challenging to answer this question because whom do we contact at the very end if this is happening, right? I think we should probably think from a specific person's perspective. So what do these individuals want to do? How do they want to take things further? The first thing is obviously try and, you know, bring them together, talk about this, whatever is happening. It sounds that if they are accusing each other, there may be equal power between them, possibly. So you know, the escalation of the actual bullying may not be as developed. You know, one party is not completely powerless, hopefully. But you know what, in some cases, if this is an ongoing process and this is such a depleting process, I think the only option is to really consider finding another home for yourself, you know. It's just sometimes the fight is not worth engaging in, you know.
Thank you, Milda. The next question is from Rebecca, who asks, what is your advice on organizations which try to cover up, keep bullying out of the public eye?
Well, this is what many organizations used to do in the past, and some are still doing this. And this again may be because of lack of awareness. I think that you, as possibly if you are a business psychologist or a person working in that organization within human resources, you could talk about, you know, this functionality of this phenomenon. And there's so many studies demonstrating, you know, detrimental outcomes for organizations. So creating a sense of urgency is the key word that I would like to share with you. Creating a sense of urgency and really demonstrating that by ignoring this, organization will not benefit. You know, they will just go down and down and down as the time goes by. This is what you can only try, and this, if their decision is to continue, well, they will have to face the consequences ultimately.
Thank you, Milda. The next question is from Sandeep, who asks, in your experience, have you found that targets generally are able to overcome bullying in their workplace, or do they tend to leave the organization as a result?
Jeremy, what was the first part of the question? Whether they tend to
overcome bullying,
oh,
or do they actually leave the organization?
Unfortunately, they tend to leave organization. Unfortunately, for many reasons. One reason is because they feel like this is useless, this is helpless. You know, it's like I won't be able to fight this whole, because this is part of the system. So, you know, it's like I can't, being an individual, I can't change the whole culture. Partly because it's just really stressful, you know, and they just find other options that are better for them, and partly because they are not aware of what is actually happening, and they may not be identifying this as workplace bullying per se, you know, so they are not aware of the actions that they may engage with.
Thank you, Milda. The next question is from Mohammed, who asks, as a researcher, how could we observe the behavior of perpetrators?
There are a number of ways. One way is to ask people, whether they engage in these particular behaviors at the workplace. It's a tricky one, though, because obviously people will not be very much inclined to report their negative behaviors, but it's still an option. Another way is to survey our, bystanders, people in the organization, and talk about behaviors that they observe, and aim to identify, perhaps focusing on specific departments or teams, what's happening. And you can do that both as a qualitative approach and as well as quantitative approach, trying to understand these behaviors in more detail. And of course, you can also, you can be even more creative and talk to possibly leaders or even customers or clients. It depends on how engaged they are. So for example, when we work with students, students become kind of closely intertwined with the dynamics of the team, and they may be noticing something in the way we deal with each other, the way we communicate. So that can also be a source of information.
Thank you. The next question from Limal. You highlighted the importance of policy. Are there any templates or policies you can recommend, or any organization who have leading policy in this area that are accessible or public?
Oh, wow. Okay, so I think yes. I would not want to recommend something that is not 100%. I was quite recently attending Leaders Forum by United Nations. They have some interesting initiatives there, but mainly focusing on gender equality and inclusion. You may wish to look into that. But apart from that, you know what? I can't think of anything specific at the moment. I think you can probably learn from both. What I would like to recommend for you is to look into great cases, but also into challenging cases. So, for example, Houses of Parliament reports you can easily access and download online. You can just Google it and look into recommendations that were proposed for the Houses of Parliament, and you may wish to consider adapting or adjusting some of the ideas that they mentioned there.
Thank you very much, Milda. This was the last question for you. There is a question from Helen, who asked whether the video recording or the slides will be made available. And I think Cindy or Melania can answer this question.
Hello, hi, this is Cindy. Hi, yes, this will be available to everybody who's registered, and it will be on the link. So I'll send everyone the link, so you can just access it. Okay. Thanks, Milda. This is a fantastic presentation. It's really insightful, and I've learned a lot from this. just to add while I'm talking to you.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you everyone for great questions. And thank you for joining me today once again. I really appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Milda.
Thanks, Milda.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Pamela. Jeremy, thank you. Thank you for, coordinating all this event. This was a great help.
Thank you, Milda. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy.